dissent has been growing since the 1960s in the Western world. And people are far more sophisticated now. I mean, even popular culture reflects the fact that anything from The X-Files to the film The Insider, that the idea of people discussing things, of trying to manipulate public opinion, I mean, that's highly developed now.
Sure, but when people were under the lash, they knew about it too. People are so aware of it that it has led to tremendous cynicism about almost anything. I mean, nobody believes what government officials say. Nobody believes what they read in the press. People don't believe professions. It's led to enormous cynicism and tremendous opposition. In fact, in my view, the more crucial things than the ones you mentioned are opposition to aggression. I mean, just take a look at the current war in Iraq and compare it with, say, the Vietnam War. It's a comparison which is often made, the protest. But the comparison is completely false. The opposition to the war in Iraq is far greater than it ever was to the war in Vietnam at any remotely comparable stage. I mean, this is the first war in European history, Europe and the United States, first one I can think of, where there was massive protest before the war. It's never happened. I mean, in the case of the Vietnam War, there was no protest until years after the war began. I mean, just in the last 30 or 40 years, say the United States, the level of civilization among the general public, not intellectuals, a separate category, but among the general public, it's advanced enormously.
So do you think that intellectuals are not sufficiently engaged? Do you think they have become cynical?
Intellectuals are a separate category. Intellectuals are mostly servants of power. I'm talking about the general public, not the intellectual world. They remain pretty constant. I don't think they're subject to these changes, except marginally, of course, to some extent. But they're quite different. And quite generally, it goes right through history, intellectuals have been servants of power. Take, say, the First World War. On all sides, Germany, England, the United States, France, intellectuals were extremely enthusiastic about the war. There were a few dissenters, and the best known of them ended up in jail, like Bertrand Russell, for example, or Eugene Debs in the United States, or Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. Very small group of critics, some of them best known imprisoned, but most intellectuals were enthusiasts for their own country, and that's common, and it remains common. I mean, intellectuals write history, so you have to be a little cautious about what they say about themselves. And it looks prettier when it's written in books.
So do you then think it's a failure of the left, then, in the United States, that if there is this feeling that a war is not right, that there isn't more action, more political action about it?
Depends what you mean by the left. I mean, the left, what I mean by the left is out in the meeting with the public all the time. It's out in the streets. And so there are meetings of thousands of people. The biggest university in the country, the University of Texas, came out with a strong anti-war declaration. That's never happened in the past. You go to working-class towns, and thousands of people show up for demonstrations and meetings. That's what I'd call the left. It's not the articulate left, but then the articulate left is never permitted expression. So during the Vietnam War, you didn't hear them either. I mean, the New York Times, for example, would never permit a comment by someone on the left committed to the involved in the peace movement, maybe a sentence here and there. But that's standard.
As far as your attitude to government is concerned, I mean, you have been known for many decades as being an agitator against what you see as bad government. I mean, some people have wondered sometimes whether perhaps you could have, alongside the criticism, offered a little more in the way of solutions as well.
There's plenty of solutions. In fact, that's all I and other people offer is solutions. Often the solutions are don't carry out crimes. That's the simplest solution. So if you want to reduce terrorism in the world, let's say, there's one very simple solution: stop participating in it. That doesn't end everything, but it cuts back the amount of terror by quite a notable amount. So that's a simple solution. If you want to look at other more complex cases, take, say, the Israel-Palestine problem. I think there's a solution, namely the one that the large majority of the American population support, which happens to be the international consensus on a two-state settlement that the U.S. government rejects. Okay, so there's a solution for you. Let's just follow the will of the American population and go through the list. For example, on say, environmental issues, there's plenty of solutions. It's claimed that what you say is correct. That's what's claimed by the intellectual world, that no solutions are offered by the critics. That's just nonsense. It's just they don't like the solutions.
Since you first started in political activism in the 60s, do you feel that you have made a great deal of headway?
I think the country has made a great deal of headway, and I'm happy to participate in it, but it's not traceable to individuals. I mean, these are mass popular movements, and big changes in culture. It's across the board. If you go back to the 60s, for example, there was no feminist movement, there was no environmental movement, there were no third world solidarity movements. There was no substantial anti-nuclear movement, no global justice movements. I mean, these are all developments of the last 20 or 30 years, and they come from all over the place. For example, the solidarity movements, which are quite unique. There's never been a time when people from the aggressor country went to the victims and lived with them to try to protect them. That happened in the 80s. Tens of thousands of Americans did it, and they came from conservative circles. A lot of it was church-based. And it came from Main Street in the United States. And now it's all over the world. So you have people, say, in the Israeli-occupied territories, in Colombia and all over, trying to help the victims.
And yet you say there's this groundswell of support on Main Street, and yet you have a right-wing government there in Washington at the moment, and you have a great discrepancy between the way that the rest of the world increasingly views the United States and the way that the people of the United States view themselves.
That's not true. Take, say, the international economic arrangements, what are called free trade agreements, so they don't have a lot to do with free trade. There's overwhelming public opposition to them. That's why these issues never arise in elections. If you take a look at the exclude a certain category of issues, namely those on which the public is opposed to the elites. Those just don't arise. That's part of the technique of marginalizing the public. And as you mentioned before, it's not that people are unaware of it. They know it. So before the year 2000 election, about 75% of the population regarded it as a complete farce.
But in which case, I mean, what happens to transfer that kind of feeling into any kind of action? Because at the moment you have people who actually, although they may be in favour of the idea of more self-government, having more control over their destinies, they're pushed to the limits just trying to, keep their families together, keep their jobs down. There isn't going to be that kind of support.
That's part of the technique of control.
Well, isn't that going to be broken then, is it?
Well, why isn't it going to be broken? I mean, slavery was broken. You look over history, one after another form of coercion and control has been broken. As the Soviet system was collapsed from inside, every system of tyranny we know about and oppression has been, people chip away at it and it ultimately collapses. There's nothing special about them. I mean, the systems of power that exist now are quite fragile, and they know it. So the World Economic Forum, for example, is well aware. That's what the Financial Times called the masters of the universe. They're well aware of how fragile their control is and concerned about it, and rightly.
What I wonder, though, is how you square your fundamental optimism about human nature with what seems to be a pretty pessimistic analysis of what's happening in the world.
It's a famous phrase that was borrowed by Gramsci, and that we should have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. It's sensible.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much.
What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Now come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. I man.